and in any interview that you listen from him as well, knowing that regardless of where he went, he was going to find a way to succeed and build something special. Look no further than the fact that he ends up as the head of a D1 program, the youngest to ever be the head of a D1 program at 24 over at Army West Point Academy, and links up with Mike Krzyzewski there. And there's a number of different quotes that we'll read throughout the day, but Coach Krzyzewski weighed in last night. We lost one of the greatest coaches in the history of basketball today. Clearly he was one of a kind. Coach Knight recruited me, mentored me, had a profound impact on my career and in my life. This is a tremendous loss for our sport, and our family is deeply saddened by his passing. We offer our sincerest condolences to Karen, Tim, and Pat and their families during this difficult time. Again, that from Coach Krzyzewski. And there's a long list of coaches across the board, people across the board, players that he impacted, players that, even though he was viewed in the media as being living the general to the highest term, he was fiercely loyal. He was loved by his players. Even to this day, you look at any comment from a former player over the last 12 hours. Steve Alford had weighed in already and mentioned that he was one of his closest friends. For some people, and this is true with all coaches, it's a second father figure. It's a role model. It's someone that you aspire to not just make proud, but to execute at a high level. And you mentioned the credentials, and this has been highlighted nationally too. We'll get this perspective as well from Fran and Seth and Tim, but he did things the right way. You would never be able to look at the career of Bob Knight as a head coach and say that he took any shortcuts, say that his teams were anything but disciplined, that expected excellence, and that were treated the same way whether you were the best player on the team or the last guy on the bench. And there's something to that lasting legacy that speaks volumes to why so many different corners of this great sport and of the entire sports world made comment last night on the legacy that he leaves behind.
I've been hearing a lot of he was just complex. I hear that a lot.
Yeah.
I don't think Bob Knight was complex at all.
No,
I don't agree with that whatsoever. I think that Bob Knight had fire, okay? And with a lot of people, sometimes your greatest strength is your greatest weakness. And it's hard to just use a quality that's beneficial and not anything that takes away, right? Not anything that hurts you. It's hard to do that. Bob Knight just had fire, and that served him very well throughout a lot of his career, where he was a great competitor. That fueled a lot of his success. That fire also led to some of the bad moments and the outbursts and, all of that, right? Like, it works both ways. And I think that's just Bob Knight. I don't think it's incredibly complex. I think that that's the truth with a lot of people, where you're not able to downshift. You're running in fifth gear. And so sometimes it's going to be good, sometimes it's going to be bad. But this idea that, he's just such a complex individual, I don't think that was the case at all.
Yeah, I don't either. And you'll hear that same takeaway from those that played for him, that view him in that light. You didn't understand the man that he was and what he was trying to get out of his players, not just as players on the floor, but as men they would become to be. And you look at not just the success that they had on the court, but the graduation rates. That's something that was a point of pride for Coach Knight from the very beginning. Over 98% graduation rate, or in terms of placement rate from his programs. On top of that, for me, and again, I'm of the younger generation, and that's part of the reason why we want to have conversations with those that knew him closer, those that experienced him longer, as Fran, as Seth, as Tim did. But for me, even as a kid, growing up in this state where basketball is everything, like, look, Brian, I never had the opportunity once to be able to be a Division I athlete, but like all those, that have a basketball hoop in their backyard or on their garage door, I wanted to play the game, and I loved the game. And even coaches that would have been of that era that taught us the game as kids, always they emphasized being tenacious on defense and never taking plays off and not being a selfish teammate. All principles that were trickled down from the Coach Knight era. There's so much about his impact on the game that was felt through generations, that will be felt throughout time, because of what he demanded of his players, what he was willing to pass on to other coaches. Fran has a great story that he's going to share about his time when he was an assistant in the game, and when Coach Knight basically helped him and his then head coach at the time, after they had beaten them. And there's just examples of that, of where he was willing to give back to the game. And sure, yes, like, will some people point at outbursts, point at parts of his career, parts of his life? Yes. But on a day where you're looking back at what he was able to do as a coach, what he was able to do as a broadcaster, what he was able to do for the game, he's on that Mount Rushmore and is one of the greatest of all time.
Well, and that's the thing that it comes back to is, you're right. He's up there with, the legendary names of in his era. You're talking about, Dean Smith. You're talking about John Wooden. You're talking about the best of the best, and he's right there. And I think that's when it comes back to the complex thing. I think that's where it gets twisted, where on a day like today, it can be complex to talk about Bob Knight because it was a blend. It was a blend of great success, great moments, hilarious sound bites, and then the other side where there was some anger, there was some mistreatment, right? Like so it might be complex on a day like today to do the perfect job talking about Bob Knight in a way that is respectful because he just passed away, but you're accurate also. That can be complex. But as far as Bob Knight, the person, I just don't buy, such a complex individual. No, he wasn't. He was a guy that had fire, and that served him well at times, and that hurt him at other times. That's it. Like, that's a big portion of the story. So I don't buy all this, I think that's where it gets twisted. It's complex to talk about Bob Knight. It's not complex in terms of how he was wired. He was hardwired to have fire. And that's just how I see him as far as that aspect goes.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned the accolades already, but 3 national titles to his name, one as a player while at Ohio State in 1960, and he's on lists just like this throughout the entirety of his career. But him and Dean Smith are the only 2 players to win as a coach and as a player. Leads USA to gold in 1984 as coach of the U.S. men's basketball team, the last only college team or only college player rostered team to win a gold medal. Seth kind of spoke on this yesterday, but I want to get his perspective on this as well today. Able to lead Indiana to Final Fours in 3 different decades. They would go on to, again, win 3 national titles during that time. You mentioned the undefeated Hoosiers, and that's a part of the legacy that is on highlight reels throughout time until, if it is ever duplicated again, a team to put together an undefeated season and win the national championship. I mean, you think about teams that have been close in the past. That Kentucky team from 7-8 years ago, it comes to mind. And any time that there is a team sniffing it, you see those indelible images of him pleading for that group in the national title game not to throw away what they've worked for all year, and this goal of perfection for that team because he felt like anything less from that group would have been a failure. I mean, there are indelible aspects to his resume, to his Hall of Fame career that will always be through this sport. And again, we mentioned this, but for me, the fact that there are so many that were impacted by him, whether it's coaches, current coaches, former coaches, current players, former players. There's a quote that was published last night from the great Roy Williams, and he mentioned, of course, with the North Carolina ties, that Dean Smith was certainly his mentor, but the next guy for him was Bob Knight. He played golf with him, watched baseball with him, watched his practices. This is his quote: "My first year as a head coach, but more importantly, I appreciated the help he gave me in my coaching career. He acted like I was one of his guys and made me so much better. He was one of my heroes, and I'll be forever grateful to him." And there's people that even didn't play for him, but folks in this state at a time in the state's history where it's grappling for an identity and something to cling to, and in comes Bob Knight and completely changes and reestablishes and makes Indiana not only a college basketball brand, but a brand across all of sports. You mentioned the Notre Dame thing. When you mentioned South Bend, that is the response is, oh, Notre Dame, about New Rockne, the Gipper, all that good stuff. Like you get those comments. When you say you're from Indiana, just the state as a whole, inherently, that's one of the first names that's going to be thrown at you is, oh, so do you like IU, Coach Knight, Hurry
Yeah.
like that? That is indelible, an identity of the state for such a long time, and is why so many people, not just nationally, but those that cherished him on the IU fan base and beyond are mourning through last night into today.
Well, and that's the thing, too, is sometimes to really understand the type of success then with Bob Knight is to envision the same type of success being recreated. Like, think about this for a second, Jimmy. I know you bleed IU hoops over there. Imagine if IU went undefeated this season, and then 5 years later, they won another championship. And then 6 years later, they won another championship. You're winning 3 championships by, we'll call it 2035. Would you sign up for that today?
Absolutely.
I think you would, yeah. But that's what Bob Knight did. Like, that's just an insane amount of success. And it really, I don't know, it really hits home in a different way when you think about it like that, if it were to be relived today with this version of the IU Hoosiers. The other thing I think of with Bob Knight is how ahead of his time he was in ways where you think about the motion offense and ball movement and what we're seeing with spacing and positionless basketball in this day and age. A lot of that started with Bob Knight. We're talking in the mid-'70s he's doing that stuff, you know? And it's still a part of the game today. That's an incredible compliment to the basketball mind that he had. It'd be like football, whether we're running like, I don't know, the West Coast offense with Bill Walsh. You know, some of those principles from way back when that are still a part of the game. It's like, holy cow, you're like the Jimi Hendrix of your profession, where you're doing stuff that was way ahead of your time when you did it. And the other part of that is some of the things that Bob Knight said and the antics were not ahead of his time at all. Like, there's no way that stuff would translate to today. So he was in the right era to be the type of communicator, I would say, right? Like, that didn't work in today's era, but luckily he was in a previous era where it wasn't as frowned upon as it is today.
You mentioned other clips, and last night, like many, you're just watching different moments throughout his tenure and throughout his coaching career of just viral clips that are being shared across. And you mentioned maybe what's an indelible moment. Maybe it's not the greatest of all of them, but his analysis of Michael Jordan before he played a single second in the NBA to declare him as the greatest basketball player I've ever seen. And there's that other quote that's floating around where Portland was like, no, we need a center. And he's like, no, go ahead and draft him as a center then.
Yeah.
If that's what I mean, there are multiple different air markers for where his basketball brilliance and acumen are shared. But in terms of that one, and to be as right as he was about what he was seeing is just a microcosm of his basketball mind as a whole and at play.
No doubt about that. I've got a couple of clips over here. This was great about the bench being a motivator. Check this one out.
You can talk about all the motivational speeches and phrases and devices in the world, but the greatest motivator of all is your ass on the bench. There is no better motivator. Ass meets bench. Bench retains ass. Ass transmits signal to brain. Brain transmits signal to body. Body gets ass off bench and plays better. I mean, it's a hell of a sequence of things that takes place.
That type of stuff was hilarious. This, depending on which end you were on, if you're the fan and you're just watching a clip, or some of this stuff is freaking hilarious. If you're the media member this is directed at, maybe you have a different perspective, right? But this was Bob Knight on helping sports writers. Here you go.
Just remember, when you're at a game and you see grass, it's the opposite side of the ball. But if you see hardwood out there, it's the other end of the floor. Try to help you young guys in this profession you've chosen that's 1 or 2 steps above prostitution.
Like that. I think this, Jimmy, is... You ever hear someone with a bad autograph story? You've had to have heard someone where I went up to so-and-so and he just blew me off, man. And that hits home. Like, they don't forget about that, And so there are some people with the equivalent of a bad autograph story with Bob Knight. But like you were pointing out, there are so many people that have good autograph stories. You know, there was Tom Izzo talking about Bob Knight and some of the things that he had to say. He was a guy I idolized when I got here in 1983 because Bobby Knight was the man. He treated me great, and he helped me. I wish people knew what a great heart that he had. He was a different dude, but if you needed some help, he would answer the bell. The game has lost an icon. So that's where I think it can be complex in terms of how you might have been treated or what your exact interaction was with Bob Knight. Because there are some people that be like, oh, man, it's a bad autograph story. And there are a ton of people that would tell you the opposite and what a great dude he was, how he helped him, what a great heart. Like, that's where it can be complex. But in terms of how he was hardwired, I don't think complex at all.
Another quote to be thrown out there, not just because he's another legend in his own right, but because especially when their coaching days were done, you saw a lot of them together in recent years. But the Purdue great, the legend himself, Gene Cady, Purdue basketball, releasing a statement earlier this morning from Gene Cady, quote, "My deepest sympathies go out to the Knight family and all the fans he had over the years. Bob was one of those guys that had everyone's respect as a coach, but he was a great friend to me. He was special in my career because although we had many battles, we always respected each other in the game. When you faced his teams, you had to be at your best and try to get your team to be its best too. Lots of great memories of our time together. It's a sad day for me and for college basketball." Gene Cady, of course, and it just speaks to the level of respect those two had together, that statement. But Cady, the only coach in the Big Ten to have a winning record over Bob Knight.
Yeah.
And those are two programs, again, linked forever, intertwined together, but two icons of those respective programs and icons of the sport.
Well, and I also think about this, too, Jimmy, especially when someone that lived a full life like Bob Knight, he made it to 83 years old. It's always sad when someone passes away. You know, there are moments that will not be recreated. There are conversations that you can no longer have. You know, we get how sad it is. But I look at it the opposite way. Oftentimes, what a life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, think about all the living that guy did within his 83 years on Earth. He did a lot of stuff, you know? And so I know it's sad on a day like today. And it reminds me a little bit of John Madden. Well, I think there are a lot of people that might not have ever met Bob Knight that feel like they lost a friend. Like, that's how I felt with John Madden. I've never met the guy while he was alive, but I watched him so often, and it felt like you knew him, you know? And I think a lot of people feel that way about Bob Knight, and that's always sad when you feel like you lost somebody. You feel like you lost a friend, but man, like, that is an unforgettable dude. And what he was able to do within his 83 years, that's something that you can feel good about and feel happy about while feeling those emotions of sadness when he passes away.
The other moment that I think matters a ton to not just basketball fans, but IU fans especially, the fact that he was able to return to Assembly Hall back in February 2019 or 2020 and was able to be there and, you know, get roses from the fan base and there be some closure, at least for IU fans, the program itself. And that's going to be, I mean, it's at the end, of course, of his life, but the fact that there was able to be that type of chapter and verse of his IU career and that to happen for so many people that adored the coach, that adored everything he did for Indiana University this past weekend, or I can't remember if it was last week, but Mike Woodson recently said that Bob Knight is Indiana basketball, and that cannot be questioned. He is everything that program is, and he is everything in terms of what that program turned into as being a blue blood and a national powerhouse.
Yeah, and I thought that was a great moment for a lot of people. I thought it was great for Bob Knight. I thought it was great for a lot of the fans. Listen, sometimes the fans, they get, you know, it's like a stray bullet, basically. You know what I mean? Like, they're just caught up in it, where it might be beef between the coach and the administration, right? And now it's funky and it's weird, and you're just caught up in it as a fan. So it was cool to see that for sure in 2020 with Bob Knight being back there. And not just closure for him, but like you said, Jimmy, closure for a lot of fans. You know, they just think of Bob Knight as this legendary coach, and he was completely on the outs and ticked off at the university, and university ticked off at him. But to be back there was a really, really cool thing. Like you said, Jimmy, lots of guests to get to. Fran Faschilla is on deck. Mr. Fran Faschilla, I know he has a lot of interesting things to say about Bob Knight, ESPN college basketball analyst. He'll join us right around the corner. I'm Brian Noe in for Jake. He's Jimmy Cook. It's Query and Company here on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
I wouldn't be surprised if it's this Sunday.
The Ride with JMV.
Weekdays 3 to 6.
On 93.5 and 107.5. The Fan. Query and Company. On 93.5 and 107.5. The Fan.
I'm Brian Noe in for Jake. He's Jimmy Cook here on The Fan. Pleased to welcome in Fran Faschilla, ESPN college basketball analyst, joining us here on The Fan. Fran, you know, Bob Knight passing away at the age of 83. It's a sad day for a ton of IU Hoops fans. What are some of the things that you think of immediately when you think of Bob Knight and your interactions with him throughout the years?
Well, they were many, and they were mostly great. Some you know, I like many guys. I was on both sides of Coach Knight's good moods, but for the most part, I love the guy. I stayed close touch with Pat and the family. I knew this day was coming, and of course, I covered him out at Lubbock when I was at ESPN. But quite frankly, Brian, in 1972, I was a 14-year-old kid in Brooklyn, New York, and I discovered Coach Knight when he took over at Indiana. And like many young coaches, Coach Knight had an amazing influence on my career. I will say this to you guys. There were two men in college basketball who revolutionized coaching over the last 50 years, Bob Knight and Dean Smith. They were close friends, as you guys probably know. Coach Knight was simplicity and execution. Do one thing really well on offense, do one thing really well on defense. Coach Smith was the opposite. Surprise and change, multiple defenses. The two of them had an amazing influence on basketball, and I was just fortunate through the years, either as an assistant, and I'm a former Buckeye, where he played, as you guys know. I spent 8 years in Ohio coaching, whether as an assistant coach, a head coach, a broadcaster. Coach and I crossed paths a number of times, and I have a lot of memories.
Fran, you had a great story that you shared on Twitter last night that I'd wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing it with our audience. A time you crossed paths with Coach Knight back in the 80s while you were an assistant at Ohio.
Well, I think it speaks to Coach Knight. You know, we all saw the fact that he was a complicated man, obviously, the tendency to lose his temper and, you know, the anger management stuff. We all know about that. And some of it, I think, was calculated really from a coaching standpoint, but some of it was real. We know that. But we played as an assistant at Ohio University in it was 84-85 season. I think it was Steve Alford's sophomore year, if I'm not mistaken, coming off the Olympics. And we played Indiana on a Saturday afternoon in December. We were constantly at the top of the MAC race, along with Miami of Ohio and Ron Harper and that crew. So Danny Nee was our head coach. He had been a Digger Phelps assistant. Coach Knight and Digger were very close friends going back to their days at West Point. And Digger was an assistant to Chuck Daly, believe it or not, at Penn. So going back to the 60s, they were very close. So he took a liking to Danny. We get beat 91-76. It was a Saturday afternoon. It was a great thrill for me as a young coach to be in Assembly Hall. And in the handshake line, Coach Knight told Danny, call me tomorrow. I want to tell you about your team. So the next day is a Sunday. I go to church. We meet with Coach Nee at about noon on Sunday. He had just had about an hour-and-a-half conversation with Coach Knight, had about 10 pages of notes on a yellow pad. And Danny proceeded to tell us all the things Coach Knight thought that we did well, things we could do better, ways to get other certain players shots. He basically scouted us for ourselves, and we took everything he said to heart. We implemented it. We wound up winning the MAC that year, going to the NCAA tournament. But there's a million stories of Coach Knight reaching out to helping people behind the scenes, whether it was coaches or people in the Bloomington or Indiana community that, go unnoticed because he didn't want anybody to know that. But I always remember that because he was a coach's coach, and he was what I call a ball coach. You know, if you beat him, if you did it the right way, he shook your hand. If he beat you, he'd compliment you on your team. And I always remember that story.
Fran Faschilla joining us here on The Fan. What's your best guess as to why that was? I find that fascinating, where there could be someone that says, hey, look at what I did, and I'm not such a bad guy, and you guys have me misportrayed, and the narrative. And Bob Knight wasn't like that at all. Is that just the way he was, or do you think there's a reason why that's the way he was?
You know, Brian, I think we all have, and I've studied this man since I was 14, as I said, 1972. I think Coach Knight, I have to say this the right way, I think he's maybe the most honest man I've ever known in coaching, from the standpoint of he did not care what you thought of him. He at times acted boorishly as a bully. We saw it. I lived it a couple times. I'll tell you an interesting story in a second. But he just was who he was. He wasn't going to he wasn't going to have anybody influence who he was. Most of it was for the good. If you just see the reaction of most former players today, he told them right up front, the 4 years you play for me will be the hardest 4 years of your life, but you'll have a friend forever. I think that was basically true for the most part. And just to share another story, I was a broadcaster when he was at Texas Tech. I was thrilled to get to know him even better because, again, he was one of my idols growing up. And so he finds out third hand that I had said something that third hand he thought, he didn't like. And it was kind of bogus, really. But so they're getting ready, Texas Tech, to play at Kansas, and he tells his SID, I don't want that guy coming to our shoot-around on Tuesday. They're getting ready to play KU in Allen Fieldhouse. So I call my boss at ESPN. I tell him the story. I said, what should I do? Should I go to practice or not? And he said, do what you want. Well, knowing Coach Knight through the years and studying him, I said, I'm going to practice. I don't give a rat's behind. I show up at the shoot-around. The team comes walking in. They start shooting. He gives me the evil eye. He's looking over at me. I'm at the other end of Allen Fieldhouse. 15, 20, 30 minutes go by. They finally take a water break. He comes barging over to me, and he says, hey, you think we should recruit junior college players? And I said, yeah, Coach, you're in West Texas. There's a ton of them there. He goes, yeah, me too. I agree. And that was it. Like, it broke the ice. I was on his good side again. And I just think he wanted to test me out to see if I was tough enough to show up at practice. And I think, you hate to say it this way, but sometimes when he was a bully, you'd have to stand up to him and tell him what you thought. And I found that to be the case. And we had a really good friendship after that. I visited him out in Lubbock late in his career out there. I thought it was phenomenal that Karen and Pat and Tim moved him back to Bloomington where he could be among friends, family, his doctors, etc. But I got a chance to visit with him when he was in Lubbock after he retired, spent 3 hours one day with him, and I brought him the new Ulysses S. Grant book written by Ron Chernow. He was starting to lose his faculties then, but, I cherished the opportunities to be around him when I was.
ESPN's Fran Faschilla is our guest. Fran, this is a question I'm going to ask all of those that join us today. Where do you feel he most impacted the game, and where would college basketball be without Bob Knight?
Well, as I said earlier, he and Dean Smith did more to revolutionize coaching in the last 50 years. Nothing's been invented in basketball unless your name was Newell or Claire B. or Hank Iba. Ironically enough, three guys that had a great influence on Coach Knight. But going back to the mid-'60s to the current age now, Dean Smith and Bob Knight influenced basketball coaching more than any two human beings. And they obviously are two of the winningest coaches of all time. They did it different ways stylistically, but the thing that remained constant was just their love of the game, their love of teaching the game. And Coach Knight's philosophy of offense and defense is not unlike a Bill Walsh West Coast offense, the air raid with Mike Leach. There are parts of Coach Knight's offense and defense that are probably representative in 80% of the coaching styles today in one way, shape, or form. So he had a huge influence on the coaching community and the way the game is played, the unselfishness, teamwork first. Think about it. Isaiah Thomas is the only NBA All-Star that he coached at Indiana. He did it with guys like Buckner and Scott May and Alan Henderson and Damon Bailey and Todd Leary and even Pat Knight, who wasn't a bad passer, by the way. But he did it with guys that he felt he could coach in his system, and he did it well. And I think that's the legacy from a coaching standpoint.
I find that interesting. I'm sure you do, too, from a coaching standpoint. When you compare Bob Knight and Dean Smith, as you said, Fran, and just some of their philosophical differences, it blows my mind that both guys could have massive success being so different with their coaching styles. Is that how you feel about it also?
Yeah, well, most coaches these days are a combination of both, like you might be a man-to-man guy but still play a little zone. You might be you might be a set play guy, but you got a little bit of freedom in your offense. We see that a lot today in the NBA and the influence of international basketball with big guys who can handle the ball. And, if you think about it, when it was the case where his big guys, not necessarily a Kent Benson who was a low post guy, but if you think of guys like Alan Henderson playing away from the basket, different players he's had through the years, bigger guys, I would say, not necessarily centers, but, you had to play, you had to handle the ball, you had to pass it, you had to shoot it if you were going to be really good in his system. So most of us who got into coaching then became really a combination in some way, shape, or form of both. And that was the influence. And if you don't mind, I want to just share one more story with you.
Sure.
When he was finishing his career at ESPN, and as you guys, if you watched, he didn't really do a lot of preparation. He'd say the big red-haired kid or number 23's got to screen a little better. And we all remember that. And at the very end of his career at ESPN, the last part of, his contract was coming up and he wasn't going to renew it, or they weren't going to renew him. They asked me, I'm like Mr. NIT, doing the NIT has always been fun for me because it mostly has been at the Garden. By the way, next year, Hinkle Fieldhouse, and that's going to be fun. I hope I'm there. But so they asked me, would you mind doing a three-man booth with John Saunders and Coach Knight? Now, honestly, guys, Dick Vitale knew him better, probably Jay Billis because of his association with Coach K, but nobody knew more about Coach Knight than I did. I studied this man from the time I was 14, so I said, absolutely, I would love this, and I was close to Pat at the time, and Coach obviously knew me well from his days at Texas Tech. So we come to New York, opening game, semifinals at the Garden. A couple minutes in, and a kid takes a bad shot, and I say to Coach Knight, Coach, that's not a shot you'd have let Buckner take. And he looked at me and smiled, and we were off to the races. And later on, I said, Coach, what was it like bringing Army down here from West Point to play in the NIT? And again, his eyes lit up, and we had a fabulous 2 days calling games. After the semifinals, he slaps me on the back, as he did so many times from so many people, and he said, that was really enjoyable. And a few minutes later, I got a text from Pat, and he said, thanks for taking care of my dad. And it was my way of saying, Coach, I'm going to make you look good, even at the end. And John Saunders and I, the late John Saunders, who was such a great man, we were just giddy like kids that we had Coach Knight with us for 2 nights. And he actually liked doing the broadcast. And he didn't say – he might have said the big red-haired kid once or twice, but I certainly kind of, was able to – set him up, if you will, and it was a great moment for me in my broadcasting career.
Fran, last thing from me. I know last night you were on the hunt for Prepare to Win, his iconic motivational series back from 1985. I'm sure you've rewatched some of that since then. Does it still hold up, and how much would you advise people from all walks of life, but especially current coaches, to go give that a look from Championship Productions?
It took me 25, 30 years to find that video, because after we played Indiana in Bloomington, as I mentioned, we watched Prepare to Win at Ohio U before every pregame meal the rest of the season. We have guys 35, I guess it's 40 years now later, almost 40 years, that can still recite parts of that. The mental is the physical is the 4 is to 1. In order to win, you got to eliminate the things that go into losing. That's like etched in our brain. I just retweeted it out from Championship Videos. It's a 20-minute video, and it absolutely still stands the test of time today. It's not X and O's. It's just a philosophy of how to prepare to win, and it just gave me goosebumps every time I've watched it. And I think we've got it out in 10 parts on Twitter, because it's on TikTok. Don't ask me about TikTok, but hopefully anybody who's interested can watch it. And if you're a Coach Knight fan, or if you're a fan of the Hoosiers and you go back to those days, you'll understand why he was a great coach.
Fran, last thought for me is my first thought to begin the show was when I close my eyes and think about Bob Knight, or somebody brings his name up, I don't think of just one particular moment. I think of many moments. But for someone like you who's interacted with him, had many moments in person, is there one moment that you think of more than anything else?
That incident with us at Ohio U and playing them that day, and then him calling us the next day to tell us what we could do better as a team, that probably sticks out because, Coach Knight was a purist about the game. Like, he obviously didn't tolerate cheating. He didn't like coaches he knew cheated and won. He liked Danny because he knew Digger didn't cheat. And that was his way of just reaching out, as I said earlier, behind the scenes. I mean, there's so many stories like that. I guess I was lucky later in his life to broadcast, 4 or 5 years of Texas Tech games and be in the coach's locker room, be around the West Point guys who always came out to Lubbock to visit him, getting to know Pat and Chris Beard, and getting to know Stu Robinson and Steve Downing and Steve Alford and all the guys that played for him, because you have to understand, when I was a young guy growing up in Brooklyn in the 70s, that's who I wanted to play for. I wasn't good enough. That's who I wanted to work for. I got a chance to coach against him at Ohio State, where he played. So, as I said earlier, I probably know more about him, honestly, than anybody at ESPN. I don't say that as a brag. It's just that I treated Coach Knight like a historical figure to me, and he made me a better coach on the court. And getting to know him in, mostly good opportunities. Every now and then there'd be a, occasional, situation where he kind of pissed me off, if you don't mind me saying. But for the most part, I knew who he was and why he was doing it, and I'll always cherish those memories of being around him. And none of us is perfect, so those who want to criticize him can go right ahead. I'm like many who were around him, that mostly good moments, couple bad ones, but I'd certainly take the good any day of the week.
Well, hey, Fran, really well said as always, man. Appreciate you taking some time and joining us today, and hope you have a great rest of the day, man. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Jimmy.
Thanks, Fran.
There he is, Fran Faschilla, ESPN college basketball analyst. His thoughts on Bob Knight. We'll have Seth Greenberg at the top of the hour, and more guests. Tim Brando joins us next hour. Matt Taylor at the top of the 2 o'clock hour. Coming up next, Jimmy, Coach K, he once made a comment about one of his former players that also applies to Bob Knight. We'll throw it your way next. I'm Brian Noe, in for Jake. He's Jimmy Cook. It's Query and Company here on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
Come to the field house to take on the Pacers. Tomorrow evening at 6:30 on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
Query and Company on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
Jake, he's Jimmy Cook here on The Fan. You know, I thought about something that Coach K once said, Jimmy, about his former player, Christian Laettner. Now, this was on the 30 for 30, I hate Christian Laettner. And listen to what Coach K says about Laettner, but also think about his words as if it applied to Bob Knight. Because I think it easily could, based on how both of those guys, Christian Laettner and Bob Knight, were wired and were fiery players, fiery competitors, if you will. Here's Coach K on Laettner. Check this out.
I can remember talking to Sidney Lowe, and he said, boy, that Laettner, man, he's a little bit difficult. And I said, Sidney, you have to look at Christian like he's fire, and you're the soup of a big apartment building. If you use the fire correctly, he'll heat every apartment in that unit. If you don't, he could burn the building down. I said, I'd rather have a guy with that fire.
Right, like Coach K is talking about Christian Laettner, but is that not the exact same description of Bob Knight, where he was fire? And a lot of times it served him well, and sometimes it didn't serve him well. But that's who he was. And you could tell in every facet of his coaching that he had that fiery competitiveness, but it also had the potential to burn him or some people around him. That's just who he was. But look at Bob Knight. What would he have been without that fire? What would Christian Laettner have been like in college without that fire? So we can't just talk about how it only took away. Like, it also served those guys incredibly well in multiple facets as well.
He wouldn't have had the type of success and gotten the most out of the teams that were on the floor with him without that fire, without the need to, or the lack thereof of a need to be liked by his players. He didn't care. In fact, at some points, and Fran alluded to that as well, he would use it as a tool to where, hey, it'll bring them closer together if they don't like me. Like, I don't care whether or not they like me or not. I care about what they're doing on the floor, how they're becoming better men, and how they're executing as a team. That nobody, whether you're the best player or the last guy on the bench, nobody's better than anybody on a Bob Knight coach team. And without that fire, without that tenacity, I mean, that you look at highlights of those teams, and Fran also mentioned this as well, Seth will do the same. Only one NBA All-Star throughout those historic teams, and it's Isaiah Thomas. You could make an argument that Coach Knight got the most out of less than any other coach in the history of the game, and probably make a strong argument with that, including the fact that he's one of the greatest coaches of all times. And yeah, if you remove that aspect of him, the entire legacy changes. Like, you cannot have one without the other.
Right.
You don't have the type of gentleman that left his program, and you don't have the type of success and the transformation of Indiana basketball without that passion, without that drive.
Right, and I just look at, we're all wired differently, you know, where Tony Dungy comes to mind, where he's a competitor, there's no doubt, but he didn't have the bad fiery side that Bob Knight had. You know what I mean? But that's not Bob Knight. You know what I mean? He couldn't have just done his Tony Dungy impression like throughout his coaching career. That's not who he was. You got to be true to yourself. Mm-hmm. And I think Bob Knight, without that fire, I don't think he's halfway as successful as he was, because that's just not how he was wired. So I think you have to take that into account as well. All right, we've got Seth Greenberg on the way, ESPN college basketball analyst. Got a lot of thoughts on Bob Knight passing away at the age of 83. He will join us next. I'm Brian Noe in for Jake. He's Jimmy Cook. It's Query and Company here on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
HAMV later on this afternoon. Coach's Tavern downtown. Larceny Bourbon Locks, Luna's Oil Tequila Shots with Brett Halverson, Kevin Harlan of CBS, Jonathan Stewart, the former Panthers running back, and more. I'll talk to you at 3.
You're listening to Query and Company on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
I'm Brian Noe in for Jake. He's Jimmy Cook. Here on The Fan, pleased to welcome in Seth Greenberg, ESPN college basketball analyst. As we talk about Bob Knight passing away at the age of 83. Always sad when there's death involved, Seth, but what a life, man. I look at the life that he had. A lot of living in 83 years. What are your initial thoughts on Bob Knight passing away?
Yeah, Coach Knight was a unique individual. He was complicated. He was a brilliant coach, teacher, mentor, an innovator. I mean, you think about his legacy lives through Dusty May, who was a former manager. Lawrence Frank yesterday made a huge trade in the NBA, a former manager. Mike Woodson, who's the coach at Indiana. You know, Isaiah Thomas, Keith Smart, so many people and so many lives that he touched. He was a guy that was ahead of his time in terms of how they played basketball, an innovator, where there was flow going from motion from transition into motion, whether it was how they prepared. Just a brilliant coach. If you look at coaches across the board, probably of any sport, one of the great coaches in the history of our generation. Now, obviously, sometimes the discipline he demanded of his teams, he did not possess those same traits at times, but it did far more good and impacted his former players in a way that a great deal of them probably it changed their lives.
Seth Greenberg of ESPN taking some time with us here on Query and Company. The legacy of Bob Knight from on-court success, Seth, he takes IU to 5 Final Fours, including in 3 different decades. How was he able to achieve that level of success and that level of consistency that led him to be the pinnacle figure, one of the pinnacle figures of the sport?
Agility. He had agility in terms of how he played. I thought that he did a great job of player development. I thought that, prior to the three-point line, he played a certain way. Obviously he used the three-point line. What they did offensively actually played into having some of that agility. He was unrelenting in terms of the standard and the commitment and the discipline it needed to be successful for players. He did an amazing job of putting players in position to play to their strengths. His preparation was as good as any in terms of his ability to look at something and then decide what to give and what to take away. And for a guy that was tremendously demanding, he got guys to play really hard. And if you get guys to play really hard, that means you have a relationship with them. And obviously, there are some conversations and stories that where maybe, he took it a little bit too far. But there's also 1,000 stories of, Coach Knight and his relationship with players after he coached them that, they all say the same thing. He changed their lives. The discipline that he taught them basically paid great, huge dividends in making them successful after basketball, making them better husbands, making them better fathers. And I always say a lot of times it changes the cycle. That's one of the great things about coaching. You might get some young people that have not had the opportunity to be successful unless it was the commitment of maybe a coach demanding that they do the right things and make the right decisions and have the right priorities.
Seth, that's such a great statement where getting players to play hard means you have a relationship with them. That is really interesting. And we all know about Bob Knight, the fiery side that, he clashed with people at times. But building off of your point, what were the qualities that Bob Knight possessed that enabled him to have a relationship with his players where they then would play so hard for him?
I think one thing is he didn't tell them what they wanted to hear. He told them what they needed to hear. Mm-hmm. I think that they knew that he cared because, his commitment to those guys, think about the graduation rate. He, you know, I mean, like, why did he have that graduation rate? Because, you know what? He didn't acquiesce. He made sure that they understood the value of an education, which is missing today, and quite honestly, college athletics, because we're so caught up in NIL that we forget to even talk about, you know, why you're really there. A lifetime NIL is a degree. But he never let them lose track of their academic objectives. He held them accountable academically as well as athletically. He held them accountable in terms of, you know, decision-making behavior. And I think what happens is players see that guy's helping me get better. He's teaching me life lessons. He's investing in me and wanting to mentor me. Eventually the light bulb goes on. And the light bulb goes on, and then you basically give yourself to, you know, someone that says, you know what, he wants to help me become a better person. And I think that's what Coach Knight was able to do. Now, look, every coach has detractors. Every coach has players that, you know, don't appreciate him. Now, you know, Coach crossed the line some. We cannot ignore that. Mm-hmm. But if he did cross the line, it was probably out of frustration and out of passion and care more than anything else. But he also, we cannot ignore, you know, Bob Knight was not for everyone. I mean, that's just the way it was. I played for a coach named Alabama who was Knight's assistant at Army. Coach Lowe wasn't for anyone. I mean, half of my teammates absolutely loved Coach like I do, and there are probably, you know, 10% of our teammates that loathed him because he was demanding and he was unrelenting. So, I mean, you can't make everyone happy, but if your intention is good, then that's, I think Coach Knight's intention was always good.
ESPN college basketball analyst Seth Greenberg is our guest. Seth, throughout your coaching career, how did Coach Knight impact you and your development as a coach, either directly or indirectly?
I think directly. Like I said, my college coach was his assistant. Coach used to come and do clinics at Fairleigh Dickinson. I was the highlight of my season. I was his demonstrator a lot of times. When I was a young assistant coach, when I would go through Indiana to recruit, I would always stop by Bloomington back when Jerry Govelsaab was an assistant coach, and I'd watch practice, and Coach would be gracious with his time, which was, you know, unbelievable for me. He'd let me sit in a practice. We'd talk after. When I was coaching here in the ACC at Virginia Tech, he would call our games, and I'd send my daughter Paige up to sit with him, and he'd be so funny. In the middle of practice, we went live on game day, and he'd send Paige down to me and say, you know, Coach Knight said, and he'd say, basically, usually say, you're practicing too hard, you have a game in 4 hours. And then when Paige wasn't there, he'd call one of our managers up and go, where the hell's Paige? You know, like, but, you know, Coach Knight helped set a standard of, you know, the integrity in which you did your job. I mean, that's really the big thing. And you know, I admired his teachings, and he was always good to me. Even when I was started working at ESPN, he was still working there. You know, I got a chance to spend a lot of time, did a couple of Final Fours with him, and you know, probably because of Coach Lababo, and because I coached Pat. I actually coached Pat at the 5-star camp way back in the day, and that was another great story. So I ended up drafting Pat, playing in the highest league, and you know, Pat was, I think he was a junior, and he, you know, I knew Coach from Coach Lababo, and he came walking up and he goes, "Now, hey, one thing, don't put up with any of his bull. You know, just coach him hard. And, you know, tell him to, you know, shut the blank up." So, which was great. So, I mean, again, I have nothing but fond memories of my interactions with Coach. And he was so gracious when I used to come in there and watch practice. And, you know, he was demanding. I mean, that's the way it is. He was demanding, but he was a savant in terms of a coach. And I don't think people understand just how much he loved his players in his own unique way.
He's Seth Greenberg, ESPN college basketball analyst, joining us here on The Fan. It's funny, Seth, when you think about a personality like Bob Knight, the stories just don't end. And so if you could share a story with us, maybe something that caused you to laugh out loud, something Bob Knight said to you personally, or something that you observed from afar, what's something that comes to mind for you?
Well, the funniest is they had a dinner, kind of a roast of my college coaches, a fundraiser, Charlie Dickinson, and he was there, and he spoke, and he loved Coach LaBabo, but he got up there, and Coach Lowe's wife's name was Ruth, and Ruth, she was an amazing woman, just, like most coaches' wives, just did so much that no one would ever see, but only as Coach Knight could do. He got up there and he said, "Hey, Ruth," that raspy voice of his. "Some people say you're a pain in the rear." And he had this long pause, and he said, "But a pain in the rear goes away." And I'm sitting with Mrs. Lowe, and she's just shaking her head, and I'm like. And she was literally there. And he, it's funny, we have a group text of the guys that played for Coach LaBabo, and, we have all responded to Coach Knight's passing. And, we all said the bottom line is that Coach LaBabo, Coach Knight loved older coaches and respected older coaches. Like, if you think about, whether he was talking about Claire B. or Pete Newell or Coach Iba, he had he revered those the godfathers of our game. And I think that's missing today. I don't think there's enough appreciation for those who came before us as coaches. And Coach always paid his respects to those.
Seth Greenberg taking some time with us of ESPN and ESPN College Game Day. Seth, this has been the question I've been asking all our guests, and I want to get your thoughts on it as well. Where is Coach Knight's impact most felt in today's game, and where would the game be if there was no Coach Knight?
Well, like I said earlier, you think about his impact in the game. Think about all the guys today still are part of his coaching tree that are coaching. I think that's something that's really, obviously people could say, how he taught man-to-man defense, ball-you-man defense, shell drills, zigzag, all the buildups that you do in terms of coaching defense, and you say, well, what about in the offensive end? His ability to teach 3, 4, 5-man motion, he caught them all. They ran triangle stuff in 3-man motion. They ran, pairs type stuff in 4-man motion with a maybe not a guy in a ducker spot, but a guy posting up off the block for around 1. They were 5-man motion, depending on. He fit everything he was doing to his personnel. So as an innovator, I think that a lot of things that coaches are doing today that started with Coach Knight. I still remember my college coach, Coach LaBabo, telling me, when he get in one of those moods where I got called into the office, and he'd tell me, you little son of a, you know what? When you have your own team, you're going to look back and realize the old man isn't that dumb, and you'll be doing the same things we're doing every single day. And he was right, and I think that's a lot about same thing could be said about Coach Knight. Is that in the end, his teachings are timeless. It really is. What he taught never goes out of style.
Did you know at the time, Seth, that the offense Bob Knight was running would have this type of staying power?
Yeah, because he was teaching basketball instead of plays how to play, and it always made more sense to me. Mm-hmm. Like, make plays out of plays, and even now, I was at Connecticut's practice the other day, and you hear coaches say play ball, which basically means play off concepts. What are concepts? The game is a game of 2-man game and 3-man games. Play off of concepts, play off of spacing, play off of making the extra pass, play off of setting good screens and then reading the screening action. Don't be a robot. Don't just run to a spot, but all right, you're going to read how the defender is playing you. Well, I don't care even if you run plays. You better have counters, and you better play. You're playing off the defense. So yeah, I kind of did. It was one of those things. I never knew a time I didn't want to coach. So I approached the game and people who I admired in the game in a different way than maybe a guy who's just playing. I looked at it like, would I want to do this? How would I do that? I still have a notebook of notes from different clinics I went to when I was, 17, 18 years old. So, and Coach Knight was a big part of that because he came to speak at the 5-star camp every year, and I would always have pick up something from him. That would make you think.
Well, hey, Seth, really appreciate you stopping by today to share your stories and your thoughts on Coach Knight. We always respect you, man, and hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks for the time.
All right, you guys behave yourself. Jimmy Cook, behave yourself, baby.
Appreciate you, Seth. Thanks, Coach. Be well.
That's Seth Greenberg, ESPN college basketball analyst. These are wise words. You never know with JCooks, right?
Coach is always looking out for me, man. Yeah. I love Coach Greenberg. He's the best.
He had some great things to say, man. I thought one thing that was really interesting to me, Jimmy, is intentions, right? If your intentions are in the right spot. And I think a lot of times we looked at Bob Knight, who might have said something that was out there or done something that was wild. And it's not to excuse the behavior in totality at all. But if you're trying to explain it, like where did this stem from, right? I thought that was interesting what Seth said, where Coach Knight's intentions were always good. That's what Seth said. Now, there are two ways to view that. You could look at it and say, I don't care what the intentions are. I don't care what you intended to do. I just care about what you did, Or you could look at it and say, well, knowing the intention and you're just trying to get this kid to understand the value of an education or how important it is to pass the ball to this spot, or whatever it may be, to know what's behind what was said or what the actions were. That does matter also. I found that very interesting what Seth said.
The only people that would be able to accurately comment on that type of action where it would be viewed by some as I don't care, like you mentioned, Brian, like why are you doing that? Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, it would be either players that played for Coach Knight or coaches that were in that circle that know that at times maybe you might scratch your head as to why is that happening, but the person that's doing it has a purpose for it, knows that it's going to lead you down a better path, whether it is, as Seth highlighted, the graduation rate that was underneath Coach Knight-led programs, whether it was the men that those players became, whether it was the success that they wound up having on the floor, all of that, it was all with a purpose. And that's something that those that weren't a part of it, myself included, which is why we wanted to have so many coaches on today, especially, you can't speak to that because unless you've been in those environments, it looks like insanity, right? It looks like absolute chaos, but it's led with a purpose, and there's a reason for it. And when you look at, again, the graduation rates alone and the success that those teams had, we already highlighted earlier, given the fact that only one NBA All-Star from that group and Isaiah Thomas, and they're still able to go to 5 Final Fours, win 3 national championships. There was a method to that, and it led to incredible results and incredible impact on so many lives.
Well, and something else Seth was talking about was getting players to play hard means you have a relationship with them. I thought that was an amazing statement because, look, Jimmy, we're talking about all the innovations and motion offense and positionless basketball, all those type of things, right? And that's great. But if you don't get your guys to play hard, what does it really matter?
Yeah.
So I thought that was a really, really well-said statement. Was we'll spend a lot of time thinking about this situation where Bob Knight did this or this other instance where Bob Knight said that and it was wild. And at the end of the day, his players played hard. And like Seth said, I agree with him. Are they playing that hard if they absolutely despise the guy in every facet? Like, no, that wouldn't be the case. So he had a relationship with his players. And I mean, sure, they're not going to be it's not a 100% success rate, but he got a high batting average, right? And that matters a lot because you will hear people that are the naysayers, or they might have had a bad interaction, or they might have said, well, what about this, and what about that, and how about this? And, well, at the end of the day, his players played hard, which means they didn't hate his guts all across the board. That matters.
And you look at it from not just players, but managers as well. And I don't want to misquote this or misrepresent it because I don't have the schedule in front of me, but I think Dusty May is going to be on these airways at some point later today. Dusty May was just a manager, a student manager for Bob Knight from 96 to 2000, but learned right there from the general. And you follow his entire career. It leads, of course, to one of the pinnacles of the sport, a Final Four run a year ago, or just this past season, when the Owls kind of took the entire nation by storm. And that's still to this day, with Coach May being only 46 years old, like the impact of Coach Knight and what he was able to do for the game is still being felt in so many ways. And the aspect of getting the most out of your players is a lost art at times. And even as a younger man, sure, yes, sometimes it frustrates you when people, you don't know what it was like in the previous generation. Oh, this generation soft. There are aspects to that. In my time through AAU basketball, covering that sport in high school, like, you see different coaches, different tactics at a more lower level of the sport, and it's hard to get people to buy in. It is incredibly hard to get people in any sport today to have a full, complete buy-in, and not just today, but back then too. And the fact that he was able to do it at a high level over so many different years speaks volumes to the level of respect he demanded and the respect that he got out of his players and out of his teams.
And I think also, look, man, you and I can say thousands of words today.
Sure. Right.
And there are going to be people that view Bob Knight's life and coaching career one way. There are going to be people that view it the other way. But no matter what your viewpoint is, the dude was absolutely unforgettable.
Yes.
That's the thing. Like, no matter which viewpoint you're coming from, and that guy was unforgettable. Like, with some of the things he said, did, accomplished, all across the board. And some of the stories from Fran Faschilla and Seth Greenberg are hilarious. That's the other thing with Bob Knight. Known for being fiery and having this temper, but sneaky funny, man. Like, a lot of things that he said were hilarious.
Unwavering as well in his loyalty, fiercely loyal, and just an aspect of it that, there's a great piece on 1075thefan.com. Of course, there's a lot of different obituaries and in memoriam pieces on the life of Coach Knight, but our own Jake Query had a phenomenal one on 1075thefan.com. If you haven't had an opportunity to check that out, but it speaks on his philanthropic work, and especially in Indiana, wanting to give back in a number of different ways, especially to the IU library, because his mom loved reading so much. Like, there's so many different areas of his life where, like, he was the pinnacle of not wanting that type of attention for the things that he did behind the scenes. And we've heard that as well, highlighted in the stories from both Fran Faschilla and Seth Greenberg. We'll have a conversation again a little bit later in this hour with Tim Brando. And of course, if you've missed any of those conversations and really the entirety of the day today, the Wake Up Call with KB and Andy had some great conversations as well. You can get that wherever you get your podcasts. Of course, if you're behind on our show today, just search Query and Company, wherever you get your podcasts. And the same with the Ride with JMV a little bit later today. But there's just countless stories and countless ways that he impacted people's lives and left a lasting legacy on the game that is paramount to the sport and paramount to its growth, not just of the sport itself, but of the state of Indiana throughout that era.
Yeah, coming up next, a coaching comparison with Bob Knight from another sport, and you'll hear some audio. Some people around the sports world, their comments about Bob Knight passing away at the age of 83, including a current coach that was respectful but didn't exactly roll out the red carpet for Bob Knight. So we'll get to all of that coming up. I'm Brian Noe, in for Jake. He's Jimmy Cook. It's Query and Company here on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
Hey, it's JMV, and I've struggled with...
Your home for indie sports. Now with even more ways to listen.
Listen on air.
Online at 1075thefan.com.
And on our free app.
Stay connected to all things indie sports, including the latest news, show blogs, and catch up on what you've missed with our podcast.
We're never more than just a click away.
Download our app at Google Play and on the App Store. From your home for indie sports.
93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
You're listening to Query and Company on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
I'm Brian Nolan for Jake. He's Jimmy Cook here on The Fan. So we'll get to some audio here momentarily. Quinn Buckner sharing his thoughts. Steve Kerr, head coach of the Warriors, sharing his thoughts on the passing of Bob Knight at the age of 83. I was thinking this too, Jimmy. We were just talking about coaching and players playing hard for their guys, even though they might be rough around the edges. I see a lot of comparisons between Bob Knight and Bill Parcells, former NFL head coach, most notably with the New York Giants. Similar, right? Yeah. Fiery, in your face. But their players played hard, man. And you can't have players play hard without some type of relationship with them. You might not be bosom buddies, but there is respect. And look, man, you can't, I don't care what you say, Jimmy, you can't just go up to someone and say, you're going to respect me. It just doesn't work like that, right? Like, people either respect you because that's what they've chosen. You can't choose it for them. But he absolutely had that respect from his players. There's no doubt about that.
There are different ways throughout sport as things have evolved, as things have changed over time, where, maybe methodology changes, maybe the way that teams go about their business changes, but that relationship between players and coaches, both on and off the court, is the paramount to success and the paramount aspect of being able to thrive in different situations, regardless if it's Coach Parcells, if it's Coach Knight, if it's modern examples like Coach K. I mean, without that foundational piece, your team's not going to go anywhere. They're not going to be able to have that type of buy-in. Like, yes, the fiery demeanor matters, but being able to tactically get ways to have your players buy in is at the forefront of that type of development of teams.
Now, this is one of Bob Knight's former players, Quinn Buckner. He was doing the Pacers game last night. By the way, plus 11, Jimmy. Not.
Should have put a caveat there with Tyrese not playing. I only did it for the Tyrese prop bet.
Oof.
That was tough.
Yeah, that was a rough one right there. But Quinn Buckner doing the Pacers game on Valley Sports Indiana. Some really, really well-said thoughts shared about Bob Knight. Here's Quinn Buckner.
He was a terrific man, first of all, despite all that other stuff. He really was a terrific guy. He's a great friend. And the world lost a guy who was a genius who really understood life as well as basketball. And for all of the IU Nation, I'm going to take privilege here and speak. He'll be dearly missed.
Yeah, he was emotional, man. Quinn was in tears when he was sharing those words. This is somebody else, Jimmy. This caught my attention. Steve Kerr, Warriors head coach. He was fair but not flowery. I'll say that much, right? With his assessment of Bob Knight. Here's Steve Kerr.
Coach Knight had a huge impact on the game. Really was the dominant coaching figure of my childhood after John Wooden, retired. Then Coach Knight was the center of attention for a lot of good and bad reasons, but made an incredible impact on the game, and nobody will ever forget him with that personality and that demeanor and the way he went about his business. Very complex guy, but an amazing coach in many ways.
What do you think about that?
I mean, I think that balances things out very well. Again, I would also, and Quinn would allude to this as well, but unless you played on those teams, it's tough to have the proper full-scale perspective of what Coach Knight was going for with his groups. But yeah, I mean, I think that is it's a fair national perspective for certain. On ESPN's story as well. I guess, thankfully, ESPN or Steve Kerr himself did this for me in terms of cleaning it up a bit. But Steve Kerr also recounted another incident where he ran it with Coach Knight. This is on the ESPN.com piece. honoring the legendary Coach Bob Knight, who passed away at the age of 83. Quote, we ran into each other in 1986. I was playing in the World Championship. He was doing television commentary. We had lost a game. He came to our practice, pulled me aside, and basically went on a tirade. I'd never met him before. He said, and this is not me doing this is Kerr's quote, I want you to take those bleeping bleep teammates of yours and bleep bleep and tell them to bleep bleep. And I said, yes, sir, Coach Knight. Then I went to the players and I said, hey, Coach Knight just encouraged us to play well tonight. And that was it. He was terrifying. I'm not going to lie.
Oh, man, that's funny. That's a funny story right there. You know, it's crazy, too. You think about college sports, and the most obvious way it's different than professional sports is it's just a revolving door in college. So you think about Bob Knight's profile just being boosted because he's the constant. You know what I mean? Like, his time spans from like Isaiah Thomas to Calbert Chaney or whatever players you want to mention there, you know, like Keith Smart. Or think about Coach K, right, who played under Bob Knight. And think about Coach K at Duke, where you go all the way back to the short Jay Billis days, all the way to the modern era just a couple of years ago, you know, and all those players. So that's the thing, too, is Bob Knight and Coach K, they were absolute rock stars, and I think their profiles are boosted even more because look at Coach K. We played some audio earlier of him describing Christian Laettner.
Yeah.
It's the early 90s, man. He was there for 30 years after that. So it's amazing that I think when you are the constant and there's that much success and it's just a revolving door of players around you, that's what's unique about college compared to the pros.
Coach Krzyzewski's quote about the passing of Bob Knight, we lost one of the greatest coaches in the history of basketball today. Coach Knight recruited me, mentored me, and had a profound impact on my career and in my life. This is a tremendous loss for our sport, and our family is deeply saddened by his passing. I didn't want to ask Seth this because it's hard to encapsulate it on a day like today, but Brian, it's not a big leap when you look at coaching trees and the ripple effect from what you're able to do as one coach in the years that follow, maybe those that are influenced by you or directly impacted by you. Without Bob Knight, maybe we still get Mike Krzyzewski, but I don't know that we get the version of Coach K that was another pinnacle of the sport in the modern era. I don't know that we get that.
No, it's an interesting thought. It's tricky, right? Because think of it like this. We were just talking about Josh McDaniels, the Raiders head coach, getting fired.
Sure.
We were talking about it on yesterday's show. And that doesn't mean Bill Belichick stinks.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, his coaching tree is...
Not all coaching trees are equal. Let's put it that way for sure.
But I hear you where when you're Bob Knight and you coach Mike Krzyzewski and Coach K goes on to be Coach K and traces a lot of his success back to Bob Knight, that absolutely boosts Bob Knight's profile. There's zero doubt about that. But I would argue that with Belichick and, I don't know, just name some of the guys like Romeo Crennel and Josh McDaniels and these dudes,
Matt
most
Patricia.
of them have done nothing. As coach.
Yeah.
I don't think that takes away from him.
No.
But isn't that weird where I don't think it takes away from Belichick, but it absolutely boosts Bob Knight.
Correct.
It's one of those weird things that I think is accurate, though.
It's not something that, if it wasn't there, should be viewed negatively. But if it is there, it's something that should be done to elevate the profile of a coach. The fact that philosophies that would have been passed down were able to be implemented and had an impact on the legacy of the game, even years beyond when Coach Knight, retired from coaching in 2008, and it's still felt for another decade plus in a number of different avenues, still being felt today with IU basketball and Mike Woodson there. I know we already mentioned Dusty May and FAU. There are certain levels to where, look, this is not something for Coach Knight or his family to worry about. Clearly not for Coach Knight with his passing, and by all accounts, he didn't care the way he was going to be viewed anyway. But you could look, and for this generation, it's social media or the news or anywhere, you could look across multiple different sports last night, multiple different organizations last night, and see a statement or a comment or a story about Coach Knight. And that was, again, just from the impact that he had on so many different lives, and especially for this state. Again, I encourage you, because I know he misses not being here today, but Jake Query gave a great summary of the life of Coach Knight on our website on 1075thefan.com, and it speaks to his generation and beyond, how many lives of those that didn't play for him, but those that were captivated and had something to cling to and support and rally behind and cheer for during the Bob Knight era. His legacy, yes, is felt nationally, but it's felt no more so than across this great state.
No, there's no doubt. Absolutely. And it's a basketball crazed state.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
the thing. The Hoosier hysteria is a real thing. You see basketball hoops all over the place, you know?
Yep.
And so to excel in a state where you always hear like this is a football school or this is a basketball school or whatever, like it's a basketball state.
Yeah.
And listen, man, we love the Colts, but basketball is, I mean, it's been in your blood.
Some places, when you're landing at an airport, you see pools, you see tons of houses. For as many houses as you would see landing at Indy International, on that journey, you're going to see just as many basketball hoops.
Absolutely.
I mean, whether it does not be by plane, you just drive around this great state and you're going to run into basketball hoops galore because of how much it matters here. And at a time that it was, again, a transitional dark time within the state trying to re-find itself, and you have this iconic image of success, of doing things the right way, of building something special that was such a big part of so many people's lives.
No doubt. Yeah, well said. Hey, coming up next, Tim Brando from Fox Sports will join us. And you know Timmy's going to say some things that you're going to say, wow, how'd you do that? Right? Like, how'd you put those words together, Timmy? That was very well done. But we'll find out what he has to say about Bob Knight passing away at the age of 83 and some stories that I'm sure he'll share with us. That's on the way. I'm Brian Noe, in for Jake. He's Jimmy Cook. It's Query and Company here on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
College football.
93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
This is Query and Company on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
I'm Brian Noen for Jake. He's Jimmy Cook here on The Fan. We'll catch up with Tim Brando here momentarily from Fox Sports. He might be, I'm reading through this tweet, this post on X. I'm going to need a couple more commercial breaks to read the rest of this thing. Holy cow, he's got some thoughts on Michigan and the cheating scandal going on here. Wow, Timmy B.
Yeah, definitely want to dive into that at some point here as well, because he's been kind of all over it with encapsulating everything that's been going on there.
Yeah, he's basically talking about Big Ten coaches trying to bait the commissioner to lower the boom on Michigan because they're bent about Michigan allegedly cheating. And I didn't know you could post.
Easily one of the longest posts I think I've ever seen on Twitter. I understand that with Twitter Blue, which Tim has, or I guess X, whatever they call it now, that you get expanded characters. But yes, that is by far the longest tweet post that I've ever seen on the platform. I'm sure there's longer. I've no doubt there's longer because there's some wild people out there. But yeah, that is quite a novel on there, man.
So you got to go blue to be able to do that?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure to get the real expanded ability to put, I don't know what the character count is, but to get an absurd character count, I'm pretty sure you have to be a subscriber.
I think this speaks to something negative about me, Jimmy. I'm not sure exactly. Maybe you could lay it out for me, but do you ever, when you're about to read something, just sort of skim through it just to see how much you're going to have to read? You know what I mean? Like, think about Twitter, for instance, where if there's this long thread, and it'll be like post 1, post 2, post 3. If I don't know there are 37 posts, I might start reading and then get engrossed in it and finish it. But if it's all one thing, one big clump, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I might just scroll to the end and be like, that's a whole lot of reading. I don't know if I got to commit all that time here.
I am nothing if not honest, and not usually at the start. Like, once something has my attention, I'm going to read it. But if I feel like an amount of time has passed where, okay, I have the gist here, what's left? Yes, I have scrolled through an article or two in the past and been like, wait, we still got 5 pages left in this? Okay, we need to reevaluate, maybe pause, come back, take a break. So yeah, I think that's human nature at times. Not usually beforehand. I don't do the pre-browse, but if I'm locked into something and then I feel like I think I understand the point they're going for here, then maybe I'll scroll through.
You know, I was just looking back some of the people that we've talked to today and reflecting on Bob Knight's life and certainly his coaching success. We just talked to Seth Greenberg, and we also talked to Fran Faschilla in the first hour. And I asked Fran, think about today, Jimmy, where there are a lot of athletes, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but it's just different in this era, where they're trying to control the narrative. You hear that a lot, where it's like, hey, the media's trying to spin it this way, it's really this way. And I want to control the focus and control the narrative and how I'm viewed. And I asked Fran Faschilla, who mentioned that Bob Knight did a lot of things to help people, to help coaches, and didn't want recognition for it. And I asked him, why do you think that was? Because he knew he had an image. He knew he was thought of a certain way. And he easily could have said, hey, don't look at that. Look at this. I'm the good guy. I'm doing all these positive things. And he didn't do that. And I said, why do you think that was, Fran? And he's like, I don't think he cared. He just didn't care. And something about that I think is cool. Where do you come out on that? Where I understand that most people want to be viewed as the hero. You're wearing you're the knight in shining armor and all that. Most people desire that. Most people don't want to be the heel as the WWE wrestler. You know what I mean? Like most people, when it comes right down to it, do not want that. But Bob Knight embraced it. Yeah, he certainly didn't try to change the quote-unquote narrative or perception of him. And there's something about that I actually think is cool because most of that is fake. It's like, hey, it's Russell Wilson running routes against air, just right. So you or doing high knees on the plane, just so he can be thought of in a certain way. When some people are like, "Hey, man, think what you want. I really don't care." There's something about that I think is cool.
It's incredibly admirable, and I respect it a great deal because, especially in today's society, it is very hard to be able to live that way and carry yourself in such a way where I don't care what you say about me. I don't care what you think about me. I'm going to do things how I want to do them, and regardless of what you think, it's not going to bother me.
Yeah, right. Hey, we've got Timmy B on the line right now. Tim Brando from Fox Sports joining us here on The Fan. Tim, thanks for taking some time, man. We've been reflecting on Bob Knight passing away at the age of 83. What are some of your initial thoughts about the coach, the man, all things together when you think about Bob Knight passing away?
Well, I can honestly say at a very influential time in my young career, I got to cover the general at his zenith during his greatest years. And I was starting in radio and was covering one of his great rivals, really. In 1979, I was working in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, doing radio, and had the first sports talk show in the history of Baton Rouge. And in 1981, when Dale Brown took his team to the Final Four, that was the first time I ever saw Bob. And, of course, I had not done any games yet at the national level, but I would be doing those games at the national level soon after that, by 1985 and 86. And I saw the best and the worst of Coach Knight and lived to tell about it. And can honestly tell you that I came away from what was at the time a very emotional and difficult moment with him. And I'm glad I had it, because if I hadn't had that moment with him, I don't know that we would have ever been as close as we were. I certainly felt like I was accepted by Coach Knight, but only after we had this story is told by a lot of different people in our business and in the media business. What's your first recollection of Coach Knight? And the answer is, well, we had a big blow up. We had a fight, but afterwards we were good. We were really good. and that's exactly what happened to me. I was going into Bloomington to do a game in 1987. It was just after I'd done a Michigan-Indiana game 2 weeks earlier, and the sports information director at the time, Kit Klingelhofer, told me that the practice was open. I could go to it. Dick Vitale was going to do the game with me. It was going to be Iowa and Indiana, as I recall, and he told me that practice was open. Dick had not made it in town yet, and I went to the practice, and Bob was really upset. His team had played poorly in their most recent game since I had seen them, a full week earlier on a big Monday, a game on ESPN. And he was upset. He took it out on me, and he threw me out of practice. Just threw me out of practice, and did so in a very unceremonious way and in an intimidating way. He tried to. He did. He tried to bully me, and I was young and impressionable, 31 years old at the time, and I had been told by my old friend Kurt Gowdy, who was my mentor and someone that Bob looked up to as it happened. Kurt Gowdy was my mentor, and he was a great broadcaster, did the American Sportsman, a show that was around long before you guys were born, I'm sure. But Kurt was tight with Ted Williams. He did Red Sox games, and Coach Knight idolized Ted Williams. So Kurt had told me that when I worked with or was around Coach Knight, to be prepared, to be strong. And so when he got ready to throw me out, he said, "You can get your blankety-blank out of here." I stood up in front of his team. No one else was in the gym at the time. And I said, "Well, it's no big deal, Coach, because no one learns blank by coming to your practice anyway. You run the same blank all the time anyway." And I walked out. And so I remained composed. I didn't cower. I cursed right back at him, and I went to the hotel, which was, I think, a Holiday Inn in Bloomington. And as I got to the lobby, Dick was checking in, and I was shook. I mean, I was so angry and to some extent emotional that I was almost in tears. And Dick went on about Bob. He's the general. He's Robert Buckner. He's the greatest. Blah blah blah. He was in such love with Knight, and of course I had a lot of friends in the coaching profession by that time, but the very top of that list was Dale, who was like a second father to me. And Dale and Bob had never saw eye to eye. I told Dick, I said, that no good blankety blank. I said, he tried to bully me, and I didn't let him. And I told him off. And and Dick was quick to say, oh, he's just testing you, baby. And so he just did his first game, and he thought he would intimidate you before the game. He's just testing you, my man. And I'm like, Dick, you don't understand. And he said, what did you do? I told him. He said, I'm telling you, that's exactly what you should have done. It's going to be great. You watch tonight. We'll be at the game. He'll walk up to you. He'll give you a pat on the butt and a wink and a nod. You'll know everything is okay. And so we go to the game, and he doesn't come out until right before the game starts. I'm there a couple of hours ahead of time. But sure enough, right as we were doing our open, and as it so happened in those days, we were on the same side as the benches. So as he was bringing the team out, we were doing our on-camera. Coach Knight walks right up, right behind me with his program folded up as it traditionally always was, pats me on the butt and clenches my shoulder and basically squeezes it. And I look, Vitale is talking, and I look over, and he gives me a wink and a thumbs up as if to say, yeah, man, you were a man. You took that. You're okay with me. And we were okay from that point on. Not a problem. That's a chapter in my yet-to-be-written book, which I hope to get out in the next couple of years when I get into my 40th year in sports television nationally, which will be 2025. I hope to have the book out by that time, and that'll be in it. That's almost a chapter. My first encounter with Bob Knight. That was something special. It really was.
National sports voice for Fox Sports, Tim Brando. Nice enough to take some time with us here on Query and Company. Tim, we had on Seth Greenberg and Fran Faschilla. I know you retweeted one of Fran's accounts of Coach Knight last night. We had him on earlier today, and I asked them both this question. I want to get your thoughts on it as well. How is Coach Knight's impact still felt in today's game, and what would college basketball be without his legacy?
Boy, that's all-encompassing. I don't think that the teaching, the value of teaching the game would ever be as great today as it is if not for Bob Knight's consummate teaching, which was his greatest attribute. At no point in a game or in practice did he not teach. If you weren't playing, he was still talking to you when you came to the bench or when you sat down. Like it or not, you were going to be taught by Coach Knight. I mean, it was schools in session with every one of his games. That's the first and foremost thing. And I think the other thing is he was really big on decorum. And by that I mean understanding how to play and understanding the way to carry yourself as a player. Those things really mattered to him. You had to look the part to be the part. And anybody that played for him understood that. And so the ability to the ability to set a quality pick, and his adversaries would say, or the ability to set a moving pick to make sure it never got called, would probably be his other great contribution to college basketball as the game was developed over time. You know, not many people run the motion offense anymore, but I think when they do run it, you see some coaches run it. Some will do it just to pay homage to Coach Knight. But whenever I see a team that's playing it, and generally those teams are coaches that are maybe just taking over a job, and they want to get some fundamentals involved in the way their teams practice the game, and the coaches will almost always instill some form of the motion offense into what they do, into their repertoire of different offenses. And that will never leave the game. You don't see it played as much in today's college basketball because the game is now played more outside in than inside out, which obviously that was the way the game was played in Bob's greatest years in the 70s and into the 80s, all the way up until really the early 90s. So the game has changed dramatically since then. But there'll always be some form of that that you'll see, and his tree, the branches of his coaching tree are still very much alive in the game, and those influences and that impact from those coaches that remain in the game, and a lot of them may not be guys that played for him. Or guys that you traditionally think of as Bob Knight disciples. Okay, starting with Coach K, and then go down to Jim Cruz, all the others that were once part of his staff through the years, or maybe played for him at a given time. A lot of them might be guys that just went. Now it would be guys that he met or influenced at a basketball clinic, at a coaching clinic, and maybe that kid was a GA at the time. There'll always be a Knight story that's out there, if not from someone from my generation, but maybe the Gen X or Gen Y, millennials even, because he was so involved in giving back to the game. Just as he surrounded himself with the Pete Newells of the world, and he looked up to them. Well, now all those guys, he was the Pete Newell to a lot of other people as a head coach, and then even after he finished his coaching days at Texas Tech. I got to really spend more quality time with Bob when he was at Texas Tech. I covered his team in the NCAAs for CBS, and we really shared a lot of conversations back then. He had mellowed somewhat. He had been humbled by what happened with Miles Brand at Indiana. And he changed, I think, for the good in a lot of ways, personally, more so than professionally. He was always going to be intense, and he would always hate to lose more than any other coach I think I ever covered. But he had an ability the day before a game at practice to come over and really smell the roses and visit with the guys that were going to call the game in a way that he never would. Back in the mid-'80s when I was breaking into the business. He carried himself in those days like the big kahuna with all this charisma, but from tremendous distance with media. He became better with guys like us as he got older, and he moved on to Texas Tech. And then when he got into TV and was working at ESPN, I was obviously no longer there working at CBS, but our paths crossed many times. I was doing a radio show on a daily basis for about 15 years. It was televised for a period of time on CBS Sports Network, and I would have him on, maybe a half dozen to a dozen times a year. The thing I always did with Bob was I would tape it, though. I'd never have him on live because hard breaks, he never had the patience to deal with a commercial break, or a host having to interrupt him, He's in the middle of a story, he doesn't want to be interrupted. So I always taped him before my show, and if he was as good as I thought he might be, I might run it like I might record 3 different segments and run them at different times during the course of that week, because he would have so many great stories to tell. Not all about basketball. A lot of times it could be about fishing or hunting or baseball with Ted Williams, or his love of history and the Korean conflict and World War II, all kinds of things. He was a really well-read man, a very bright individual, and someone that I valued sharing time and stories with. And so I prefer to remember him that way. He was very complex, had very bad moments, as everyone will document. But for the greater good of college basketball and really humanity, I think Bob Knight did a lot of great things for a number of people that a lot of people don't know about, and he never wanted them to know about. And those of us that were close and got to be a part of his circle at a given time were able to see that. I wish others had, but a precious few of us did.
Well, hey, Tim, very well said. Really appreciate your time today reflecting on the life of Bob Knight. And we hope to catch up with you soon, but really respect and appreciate what you had to say about Coach Knight today.
Thanks, Tim.
You got it. Well, I'm going to get the blank out of here. And if you blanking guys don't do a blanking job the next time I'm on, and if you keep blanking interrupting me like you just did, I'll never blank and do this again.
But you say the same blank every time, Tim, so what does it matter?
It's nothing blank and new, is it? It's the same old blank every time.
There you go. That's right. All right, Tim, we'll catch you soon, man.
Happy to be on. Thanks, fellas.
Thank you. There he is, Tim Brando, Fox Sports. I still watch him with Spencer Tillman calling games, Jimmy. He's still sharp. Still does a great job there.
One of the best.
Absolutely. All right, coming up next, Matt Taylor, radio voice of the Colts. He'll share some of his thoughts on Bob Knight right around the corner. I'm Brian Noe in for Jake. He's Jimmy Cook. It's Query and Company here on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
Ready Mix locations in central Indiana and is looking for Class B CDL drivers. Highlights include being home every night and every other weekend off during peak season. Shelby Materials stands behind its work, products, and people. We support our employees with competitive wages and benefits, including 401k, PTO, paid holidays, HSA, and a sign-on bonus. Learn more about your next opportunity by visiting shelbymaterials.com.
Now, what's happening on West 56th? Brought to you by Shelby Materials, the concrete and aggregate experts.
I'm Brian Noe in for Jake. He's Jimmy Cook here on The Fan. I want to welcome in Matt Taylor, radio voice of the Colts here. And we'll get to the Colts, but curious about your thoughts, Matt, about Bob Knight passing away at the age of 83. What are some of the things that you'll always think about pertaining to Bob Knight, and what do you think about his life and coaching career as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I just remember I was a kid. I was probably, fifth or sixth grade. 4 or 5 of us from the middle school that I was in or the elementary school that I was in. We caravaned down to the Bob Knight basketball camp and spent about 4 or 5 days down there in Bloomington, so I'll always remember that. Luke Recker was my camp counselor, so got to spend a lot of time with some of the guys that you just grow up idolizing, and guys that are just larger than life, wearing that uniform and being part of that program, and playing for a legendary coach like him. My dad would get tickets from his office, and he'd get 7 or 8 games a year, and he'd take me to 1 or 2 a year. And they were actually good seats, and I actually learned my first curse words going to an IU game, sitting that close behind an IU basketball bench. So that was always a good experience. But, yeah, just like everybody else is saying, I mean, iconic with this state, iconic with basketball, and iconic with that program and that logo. There's no doubt about that.
Matt, when you look at his legacy and you look at the state of Indiana, the two are intertwined. It's impossible, right, to look at all the figures, sports and otherwise, that this state has produced and not have him near or at the top of that list.
I don't think there's any question about it. I mean, I think again, I use my dad because he's, he grew up, a huge IU basketball fan, has been, sort of the barometer for me of how I should feel about certain things with Bob Knight, because he grew up with it and, experienced it. Whereas, me, I was kind of a youngster growing up, and, you don't really have the full capacity, as a 11, 12-year-old kid to understand just fully who Bob Knight is and, what he represents and just the hold that he had on the state, like you're talking about. But, my dad told me one time he was traveling for business one time internationally. I forget where he was, but he certainly wasn't in the States. And he was in an elevator one time, and just with a stranger, and the stranger asked him, where he was from, and he said, from the United States, and then he asked him specifically where he's from, and he said he was from Indiana, and his eyes lit up, and he said, "Oh," he said, "Bobby Knight," right? So that just gives you an idea of the larger than life persona that he had, and certainly again what he meant to this state, and just iconic with Big Ten basketball, and that's just what you did, man. Again, I go back to my childhood, like from mid-December until late February when that Big Ten schedule was going on. You just sat down every, whatever it was, Wednesday night at 7 o'clock or 9 o'clock, or Saturday afternoons on Channel 4, and you watched IU basketball, and you watched, the red sweater of Bob Knight. That's just what you did as a kid.
What's something that sticks in your mind the most, especially as a kid, Matt, where you're thinking about IU hoops, Colts football, just something in your mind that you flash back to from those days growing up?
Well, I just remember, soaking it all in. I think that's kind of, it's allowed me to, sort of immerse myself in sports around here, again, growing up. Like I was the kid that played a lot of sports, watched a lot of sports, certainly listened to a lot of sports on radio. I mean, listened to Joe McConnell and Mark Boyle and Bob Lamey and Don Fisher. And, I was kind of like a melting pot of all of those guys, and still take from from what those guys do and did, and it kind of forms, my style along with some other guys that you look up to. But, just being a kid in the backyard, just pretending like you're Calvert Chaney or pretending like you're Reggie Miller or, Jim Harbaugh, throwing that Hail Mary in the 1995 AFC championship game against the Steelers, right? That's just what you did as a kid. And, Bob Knight's IU basketball teams were front and center. We would – the kids in my neighborhood, we would get together and, we would, exchange, trading cards and jerseys, and we would try to find our way down to Bloomington, again, like on a Tuesday night, trying to get tickets from wherever we could. That's just what you did, dude. Like, that's what childhood was, trying to go to as many games as possible, and trying to see all these great players that this market and the state had to offer at the time. Like I said, you go back to the mid-'90s, IU's going to a Final Four in '92. They're still winning Big Ten championship titles in the regular season in the mid-'90s. The Pacers are rolling. The Colts are rolling. They're drafting Peyton Manning. It was just a great era to grow up in, as a kid in the mid to late '90s. A lot of people my age are probably driving around listening to this, nodding their head, because I had a great experience as a kid, and I have a lot of the sports franchises and those larger-than-life figures in this market to thank for that.
Matt Taylor, the voice of the Colts, nice enough to take some time with us. He's brought to you by Shelby Materials, the concrete and aggregate experts. Matt, I want to shift gears and look ahead towards the Colts side. Panthers upcoming, trade deadline now behind us, a lot of different areas we can cover. I want to cover this area first, though. I love throwing the phrase around because it's fun. Like, it gets me going whenever I hear the phrase revenge game, and it's easy to want to put that on this matchup with Frank Reich being on the other sidelines. But he's spoken to the media about it a couple times, and I know he's not the coach you directly talk with nowadays, but he's spoken publicly about it, that he doesn't want this to be about him. It's not a personal thing this weekend. What will the vibes be like going into this matchup, knowing that it is Coach Reich on the other sideline?
Well, I do know. Frank is, like, to your point, he's never going to come out and say it. He's very, very stoic. And I think sometimes people, when he was here, some of the Frank's critics would say, he's too under control and doesn't show enough emotion. Inside, inwardly, if you will, that could not be further from the truth. Like, this dude is a fierce competitor and wants to win and put in hours upon hours upon hours. I can directly attest to that, how much he worked and, what he sacrificed to, get this team over the top. And it was just very unfortunate the way it ended, but that's life in the NFL, and that's what he signed up for. And, Frank Reich is not asking anybody to feel sorry for him. But I will say, just, from a personal anecdote standpoint, I have a ton of affinity and respect for Frank. To me, it wasn't shocking at all to see him be, he was the first head coach fired in the cycle last year and the first one hired. And I think there's a reason for that. So obviously they're falling on hard times here, but, they got a long way to go to building, a championship roster. There's no doubt about that. So this isn't all on Frank Reich. He's got a lot of personnel issues that he's dealing with right now. But I can guarantee you one thing. Like, if you were going to guarantee one thing about the game on Sunday, it's this, is that those players in that Carolina locker room, they are going to play as hard as they possibly can for Frank Reich coming up on Sunday. They're going to bust their tail. They're going to give it everything that they have. And it's not to say they don't every week for them, but they know what they're playing for this week. They know they're trying to get, sweet revenge for their head coach on the team that fired him about this time last year. And certainly that just goes to show you how much can change in the NFL in a year's time. But again, you look at the Panthers season. They're 1-6. They just won their first game of the season, so they do feel like they have a little bit of momentum, having won that game in walk-off fashion. Right? It was a fourth quarter comeback, so there's something to be said for that. The way that Bryce Young marched him down the field last week. But if you look at their division, it's awful. The NFC South is terrible, and I guarantee you, Frank Reich is going to the playbook of, fellas, At Maryland, I led the greatest comeback in college football history. In Buffalo, I led the greatest playoff comeback in NFL history. We were 1-5 in 2018. We were 1-4 in 2021. Like, if you just trust me, I know we can get better week by week. We can continue to stack games on top of games and get back into this thing. And like I said, the division that they play in, 1-6, they're not out of it. And it's crazy to say that, but it's true because the NFC South is just not very good from top to bottom. So they still feel like they've got something to play for, just like the Colts with 9 games left going into the second half of the season. And, again, they're going to be playing their absolute tails off to get this win for Frank Reich against the Colts.
He's Matt Taylor, radio voice of the Colts, joining us here on The Fan. I just flashed back to Nick Sirianni last year. Remember when the Eagles won in Indy, and he was kind of woofing at the crowd on Frank Reich's behalf. And I'm with you, Matt. Look, Frank Reich's never going to show that. But do you think he feels like that, what Nick Sirianni showed? Does he feel like that on the inside, even though he's not going to show it about the Colts?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that's something that only Frank can answer. I mean, but just knowing Frank the way that I do, having, gotten the pleasure to get to know him and talk to him a handful of times a week for the last, 4+ years, I think he does a really good job of being able to compartmentalize all of his motions. Like he's the same guy. He's one of the most consistent people that I've ever met. Just very present, very thoughtful with all of his relationships. Like, he just knew how to kind of strike a chord and find a bond with anybody in the building, player, coach, people like me, staffers, things like that. He was just able to find a bond and be able to communicate and have something to commiserate with everybody. And so, I mean, I think, but at the end of the day, Frank Reich, he's not a superhero, right? He's a human being, and so he feels emotions. I'm sure he felt slighted, and I think to a degree he probably felt scapegoated last year, having been fired in the middle of the season with a lot of problems with that team last year at quarterback, and basically every phase of the ball was a letdown last season. So human nature says, yeah, I want to get a little bit of redemption, but that's just not what Frank Reich is all about. He's just all about being there right now for the Carolina Panthers, being their head coach, being there for his players, and just being a steady person. And if it all comes to fruition for him to get a win against the Colts, so be it. But it's just that's the Colts are the team they're playing that week, and it's his job to score a lot of points and design a lot of things, and try to scheme up Gus Bradley, a coach that he hired 2 years ago, and that's still here. So I think he does a good job of being able to kind of like fragment and compartmentalize all of the emotions, and he won't make it all about himself. He won't make it all about the revenge against the Colts, because it's just a football game, and they just happen to be playing the Colts, and that's who they got to beat on Sunday. And hopefully for the Colts' sake, they can rise to that occasion. Because, again, they're going to be fired up. That team's going to have a lot of energy. That building's going to be all about trying to beat the Colts for their head coach. The Colts have to match that intensity and that passion at the beginning of the game to get off to a good start.
Well, hey, Matt, thanks for joining us. I love your thoughts on Bob Knight and the Colts, and we'll be listening, man. Hope it's a good game on Sunday.
It will be. It's going to come down to the wire, and, I got to snap a 3-game skid, fellas. I appreciate you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Absolutely. Matt Taylor, radio voice of the Colts. I might be hoping for the over in that game, by the way, too, Jimmy. 44?
Yeah. We talked about that a little bit at the back end of yesterday, and as you read more about Frank Reich and the mentality, at least from that team, the Panthers are by no means a potent offense right now, but you highlighted what Adam Thielen has done. They're able to get a gritty win at the horn from Eddie Pinheiro against the Texans this past weekend.
Man, does it get more gritty than that? Just that sentence.
No, at all. At all. The whole game, when you looked at it on the schedule, screamed grit, and it was going to be ugly, and someone was going to have to obviously walk away the victor. And for those who didn't watch that game, Eddie Pinheiro had to kick that game-ending field goal like 4 different times because the Texans kept trying to jump off sides and try to extend the game as much as they could. But for where the Panthers are at right now, it's easy to look at them and say, yes, the Colts are a better team. Yes, this is a game, regardless of where the Colts are headed this season, that they should win. The emotion of that game matters. Matt put it very nicely in terms of what you're going to get when the entirety of the Carolina Panthers roster understands, even if Frank Reich won't admit it publicly, it is human nature for this game to matter a bit more for him the way things ended last year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about, and I'm not saying this is Frank Reich, but I think about Mike Shanahan. Remember the head coach where Kyle Shanahan's father, obviously 49ers head coach, Mike Shanahan, fired by Al Davis and the Raiders. And when he went to the Broncos, dude, you talk about seeing red. Oh, my gosh. I swear, he would have signed up for 2-14 in that era. They played 16 games. He'd sign up for 2-14 if both wins were against the Raiders. I swear. He freaking hated the Raiders. I don't know that Frank Reich feels the same way about the Colts, but the competitor in you.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. You got to want this more than anything else.
That's part of the reason why, Brian, I'm elevated to take your over. I feel like there's going to be some high flying action, in part because of where the Colts secondary is, but also in part of what Carolina's going to be able to do on their end.
Yeah. Gritty. A 15-13 walk-off
the definition,
win.
To quote our previous guest, Seth Greenberg, is a rock fight. It's a rock fight in the NFL is what that was.
That absolutely was. And Pinheiro came through. Whew, gritty. All right, coming up next, how Bob Knight put a lot more than just his IU program on the map. That's on the way. I'm Brian Noe, in for Jake. He's Jimmy Cook. It's Query and Company here on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
Hey, it's Kevin Bo.
Nisha Roth joins us. He's the voice of the Carolina Panthers. Anything you're leaning on that could also transition into this matchup with the Colts and the Panthers?
Bryce Young, and I've been saying this for weeks, he is about to have a game, probably in this next month, where he's going to put up wow numbers. And you're going to go, oh, that's why they took him number one. And given what's going on with Indy's secondary, I wouldn't be surprised if it's this Sunday.
The Ride with JMV.
Weekdays 3 to 6.
On 93.5 and 107.5. The Fan. This is Query and Company on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
I'm Brian Noe, in for Jake. He's Jimmy Cook. on the Fan. Interesting what Matt Taylor had to say, radio voice of the Colts. He was talking about a story where he was talking to someone and mentioned the state of Indiana, and the person goes, "Oh, Bob Knight." And it's true. I just had a flashback when I was a kid, Jimmy. So I grew up in South Bend, and I literally went to school, grade school, with a kid named Bobby Knight. He was one of my classmates, one of my buddies, right? And his nickname was the General. Like, we're kids. We're in like second, third, fourth grade, and that's what he was known as throughout grade school. His nickname was the General because of the Bob Knight. And it's just like what Tom Izzo said, and we mentioned this at the very beginning of the show, is the game has lost an icon. And no matter what your view is, whether it's flowery positive of Bob Knight or it's really critical, and that dude was an icon in the sport of college basketball. There is no doubt about that.
Well, and you had mentioned earlier, and I had forgotten this, so I apologize for it, but we didn't say it then. You mentioned other great names in sport where similarities are. Bill Parcells and Bob Knight can trace their time together back to the Army days. Like they were there around the same time. So there's a great piece as well that was shared in a couple spots, but on ESPN.com, if you search a conversation between Bob Knight and Bill Parcells, Reese Davis sat down with them and talked with both of them about their time in sports, the impact each other had on one another, the legacy of Coach Knight. But this is a piece from 15 years ago. And you mentioned going into break, like how he was bigger than just basketball. He had a profound impact on a number of different people across the world. And earlier in the show, we had that discussion about how, if you're from South Bend and somebody knows you're from South Bend, Notre Dame is the first thing that comes to mind. It's the same thing in Matt Taylor's story that his dad shared with him of you could have gone anywhere in the world, and if they had even a wrinkle of sports wit about them, if you said you were from Indiana, Bob Knight was the first name that's going to be uttered.
Yeah, and look, man, that resonates. If you live at other places, and think how many towns there are in America where if you say, "Hey, where are you from?" "I'm from Topeka, Kansas." And someone just looks at you with this blank stare of like, "Oh, okay, so that's cool, I guess." Like they don't know anything about it. But if you say Bloomington, Indiana, or if you say South Bend, Indiana, like Notre Dame football, IU basketball, it is known. And that matters, especially going back to the state is not known as big. There's nothing about Indiana that screams big, unlike an L.A., New York City scale. Nothing. But those programs do. IU basketball in the heyday with Bob Knight, it was up there. It might as well have been the Mecca. It might as well have been New York City. That's where it was in the landscape of college basketball.
Yeah, but they've been chasing it ever since. And again, they feel like they have the next person to try to lead them through that. Another piece of the Bob Knight coaching tree in Mike Woodson, who's did a nice job down there with the Hoosiers. We mentioned earlier some of his accolades for Coach Knight. Retired as the all-time winningest coach in D1 history with 902 wins. Very fitting that record would be something he would hold until Coach K passed him in 2011, another branch of his coaching tree. And you just look at the ways he was able to impact the game that are still felt today. And in terms of just legacy of on-court success, I mean, he was already throughout his career going to be thought of as one of the greatest coaches of all time. But the reason that legacy will always be around as long as basketball exists is his ability to do it in different eras as the sport was kind of changing, for him to do it 5 Final Fours in 3 different decades. And that's just not even mentioning the undefeated team, the last undefeated team in the history of NCAA Division I basketball, a ghost that teams, when every year starts, yes, everybody wants to win every game. That is the ghost they're chasing. The ghost of the 1976 Hoosiers. The legacy speaks for itself.
Yeah, you know what's interesting too, Jimmy, is I think a lot of times we evaluate someone else from where we stand, you know?
Yeah.
And look, I'm not absolving any bad behavior from anyone, but all I'm saying is if you have never been famous, I've never been famous, I've never been close to Bob Knight famous. Right? Like, I don't think it makes sense to view things from your standpoint if you have a 9-to-5 job and, you know, maybe you have a family, but you're not famous. Bob Knight was famous,
Yeah.
And to have that type of notoriety, that type of success, that type of fame and profile, and it's not easy to handle.
No.
And so I think you got to take that into account. And again, it's not to absolve anything that he said that was crazy or did that was wild, but you're just dealing and living in a different world with access to things that someone who's not famous doesn't even know about. I think it's something you have to take into account when you evaluate someone else and what they deal with on a day-to-day basis.
The other aspect of, regardless of all the accolades, which obviously led to the notoriety that came with it, but it is very hard, near impossible in today's college basketball game to be able to look at a coach and say they did everything the right way. They never cheated the game. They never took shortcuts. Like, yeah, sure, there's plenty of lists of polarizing aspects of Bob Knight, but none of them involve what he did to build the teams he did. None of them involve what he gave back to the game and what he put into it. In today's, and even in other programs at the time, money changing hands, involvement with different brands, like trying to take any shortcuts that you could, that is nowhere near rightfully so, because the way he acted as a coach, as an ambassador for the game, that is nowhere near any inch of his resume. And I think that's incredibly admirable. When you mentioned, Brian, the pressures of success, the pressures of once you've tasted championship success, the desire to repeat it, the desire to be able to build off of that success and continue it, it would be very easy, lesser coaches perhaps, be very easy to try to cheat the game or take shortcuts to go ahead and build teams at a higher level, but he never did that. And I think that is a high important aspect when looking back on his legacy as a coach.
I think it's pretty crazy. You hear this a lot of times with famous people. It's a great compliment if you say someone is, well, they're really grounded. Because think about it. You've got all these fans that are literally like lifting you up in the air on this pedestal. It's not easy to stay grounded when you have that type of reach and that type of fame and notoriety and all of those things. Because think about it. If you heard this on a day-to-day basis, Jimmy, fans just like, Jimmy, you're the man. You're amazing. You're unbelievable. Like, at some point, human nature is going to take over and you're going to think, I am awesome, aren't I? I am the man, right? It isn't easy. It isn't easy to deal with that and to stay grounded when that is at play. And look, I just think it's something that you have to take into account, where you might think you might have handled things better if in a same or similar situation as Bob Knight. It is a completely different animal if you actually did find yourself in that position.
Another nugget that was announced about 40 minutes or so ago, or at least posted by Jeff Rabjohns of 24/7 Sports, longtime writer covering IU basketball, and this was inevitable, but I'm glad to see it is happening. IU will honor Bob Knight at Friday's game as well as throughout the season. Men's and women's teams plan to wear RMK, for Robert Montgomery Knight, patches on their uniforms this season. IU football also will wear commemorative decals this weekend. But I mean, you see that anytime a legend of a program passes, there's going to be a patch. I was curious to see if IU followed in that footstep. No doubt they would, and indeed they are, with RMK patches on the uniforms this year.
Yeah, wow. The first thing I thought of was like, I hope IU football plays like they did against Penn State, at least.
Yeah.
Let's not go out there with the patches and lose by 5 touchdowns, Is that fair to ask?
I mean, I don't think that's asking a ton. No, I don't think so.
Okay. Who do they have? They have Wisconsin coming up, I think.
I believe so. I think that's right.
Got the Badgers. Yeah.
Hey, all season for men's and women's basketball. So let's leave it there.
That's a better place, better spot to leave that right there. Absolutely. Yeah, man. What a day it really has been. And I don't know. It's sort of like this too, Jimmy. It sort of makes you think and reflect on, why do you care about sports the way you do?
Yeah.
I don't want to be too tree hugger, touchy-feely on you here, but really, it's one of these deals where on a day like today, when Bob Knight has just passed away, it really does feel like community. You know, it feels like family, where you've shared a lot of moments, if you're a diehard IU Hoops fan, with your loved ones. And I don't know, it's just something that you identify with for many different reasons. Maybe it's where you grew up. Maybe you went to games. Maybe you went to games with family members. A whole list of things might be at play, but it's sort of like, yeah, this is why I am a maniac sometimes watching these games, because it's more than just the game. It connects you to so many more people than just like a game on a random Thursday night. You know, it's deeper than that, and a day like today feels like that.
It's magnified, especially in this state, and we've said this a couple of times throughout the program, but it deserves to be reiterated. When Bob Knight's able to launch Indiana onto the map, it's at a time where many small communities, many people, farmers, steelworkers, are struggling with the changes that were happening around the country and looking for something with these communities to cling to identify with. And for many people, it was Indiana basketball. It was Bob Knight. He was viewed as one of us. He was viewed as a Hoosier in the truest sense of the word, not just because he happened to coach at that school, and the success that came with it, and people were able to use it as a point of pride. That is why it's such an emotional day for so many Hooters. And yes, there's people that, again, he was a polarizing figure. You either loved him or you hated him, as is the case with so many different icons across so many different landscapes. But an undeniable aspect of that legacy is what he meant to not just IU basketball, not just Indiana University, but what he meant to the state as a whole for a decades-long span.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Yeah, very well said. And again, if we could just recreate the success, let's see IU go undefeated this year, right?
Wouldn't that be something?
Right?
Man.
Let's do that. And then, 5 years later, another ring. 6 years later, another championship. When you break, right? 1, 2, 3, break. Go Hoosiers.
when you look at the accomplishments just as they are, and you see the 3 national titles, it's like, okay, that's nice. Like, look where they happened. But when you emphasize it that way, as the fact that, by the way, the first one's 32-0, and you're going to win 2 more of these things before the 90s even arrive.
Right.
It's
by
absolute
the way,
insanity.
The third one on a legendary last-second shot, let's add that to the mix, just as little salt for the stew, if you will. Yeah. It's an amazing run. There's no doubt about that. I'm surprised we don't hear the 76 Hoosiers pop the champagne.
The way
like
the Dolphins
72
do?
Dolphins. Yeah, it's not a thing.
I was thinking about that the other day. It's not emphasized the same way the 72 Dolphins are, but you remember it from when Kentucky was on that run. Anytime a team gets close, starts to sniff it a little bit, like that's another point of pride for me as an IU alum and me as a Hoosier, that team in particular, the echoes of that team get reawoken whenever a team starts to chase that. And that's the ghost that every program to start the year, everybody wants to go undefeated. And it's so incredibly difficult to do it in college basketball. It's one of the reasons that record, or that mark rather, has stood the test of time. And that's a special point of pride, I think, for a lot of Hoosiers and a lot of IU basketball fans to know that is a ghost that is being chased every year, and it's because of Bob Knight and that group that is the ultimate prize that is being chased.
Very random, quick story for you. So I covered that Final Four when you were talking about Kentucky and Karl Anthony Towns and company and trying to go undefeated. Lost to Wisconsin. So I was there for those games, the Final Four, and then I was there for the championship game when Duke won. Then I was on the court, and Tracy Wolfson was on the court, and I was going to be like, Tracy, what's up? And then I'm like, I don't want her to blow me off. And because she was working.
Right.
But then I interviewed her years after that and told her that story. And she's like, you're so silly. I wouldn't have blown you off at all. But I always think about that. But you're right. As it traces back, it connects back to the 76 Hoosiers.
Yeah.
And that was what, 2015? I want to say
yes,
with Duke?
it was 2015 Final Four. Yep.
Crazy. Still reaches to this day. It's wild. All right, coming up next, Jay Cook closes us down in style, hopefully with some winning picks. Maybe a bunch of Will Levis overs. If you want to win some cash, we'll see if that's on his betting card. I'm Brian Noe, in for Jake. He's Jimmy Cook. It's Query and Company on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
College football coverage this Saturday on The Fan is brought to you by Reinhardt Heating and Cooling, your trusted independent American Standard heating and air conditioning dealer in Danville.
JMV here for Win Schuler's Cheese Spreads, and I'm a big fan. In fact, I keep my favorite flavors in the station fridge. I'm talking original cheddar, sharp cheddar, bacon cheddar, and pepper jack. It's a sure bet for a winning weekend spread, if you know what I mean. So, bring the smooth, bold flavor of Win Schuler's to your tailgate party, barbecue, or any occasion where friends and family get together. Because with Win Schuler's, the winning spread abilities are endless.
Hey everyone, it's Jake from Payless Liquors.
On the Fan. You're listening to Query and Company on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan.
I'm Brian Noen for Jake. He's Jimmy Cook here on The Fan. By the way, before we get to your picks, Jimmy, just saw this. We were talking about Frank Reich, former Colts head coach, now at the Panthers, going against his former team.
Revenge game.
This weekend. And what do I see? What's the first headline on ESPN.com right now? Dolphins Tyreek Hill says, Chiefs going to get this work. Right? Like, it's personal when you go up against your former team. Maybe you got fired like Frank Reich. Maybe you didn't get re-signed like Tyreek Hill or traded. You're looking for revenge, baby. I don't know that the Panthers get it, but Frank Reich certainly going to be looking for it.
Look, this isn't a bet for today, but I mentioned it yesterday. I'll reiterate it again. Might be a mortal lock of all time. Tyreek Hill anytime touchdown. Minus 120 last I saw. There's no way the cheetah doesn't find the end zone against his former team. No way.
I like your angle on this, Jimmy. I think I'm going to have to partake. Initially, I liked the under. I can't bet it. I can't watch a team and be rooting for my favorite team to not score. Like, that's what you're doing if you're taking the... I can't. I'll stay away from that. And you and I were talking off air. 27-24 gets it to the over. Like 50.5 is a high total. 27-24 doesn't sound that outrageous at all.
It feels easy, Brian. Does it feel too easy? I don't know, but it feels easy.
I don't know. Xavier Howard, Jalen Ramsey, the dynamic duo is back potentially. At least they're on track to do so. Yeah, we'll see what happens. All right, let's do this. Let's make some money.
The JCook Plays of the Day.
This is me, all right? I'm not a athlete. This is my way. This is how I win.
Tonight's Plays of the Day. First in Spurs Suns. He came very close to this and did get over it last time they met earlier this week. I'll take over 16.5 for Victor Wembanyama tonight as the Spurs battle the Suns. Let's get the bad for Brian out of the way first. I'll take the Steelers on the money line tonight over the Tennessee Titans.
Whoa. Do you realize that Will the Thrill is starting again after a sterling debut in the opener there for him?
We're going to take over a half an interception thrown by Kenny Pickett.
Okay. All right. I don't hate that.
We're going to take it over half an interception thrown by Will Levis.
Oh, no. What's the juice on that? Huh?
The Will Levis juice is minus 160. So the betting public is very confident with that.
Way off.
The Steelers get the first sack of the game. That's at minus 125. But I'll throw a positive bone because I think he can do this. Over 1.5 touchdown passes for Will Levis tonight. Steelers win, though. I'm going to take it, but the Steelers win.
Whew. What's the juice on the over 1.5?
Plus 175.
Okay, so you've got Will Levis just doing a lot of things that are going to end up on SportsCenter.
I do.
Right.
Some good, some bad.
Some touchdowns, at least one interception. And you go quick here. You're running like the Phoenix Suns, 7 seconds or less.
Steelers
offense.
money line, Levis pick, Pickett pick. Will Levis over 1.5 touchdowns. Steelers first sack of the game.
See, now this is revealing. I noticed that you don't go Steelers -3 because you realize going up against Will the Thrill Levis could come back to bite you in a big way.
We'll say it's partly that, but we'll also say that I don't really trust either one of these teams outside of I trust Mike. I mean, I trust both coaches too, but this just feels like the Mike Tomlin, that's how we won 9 games recap video.
Yeah, man, it's...
Well, we have a second, by the way, because I know we're getting close up against it. I want to remind everybody that, again, as we've honored the legacy of Coach Bob Knight, who passed away yesterday at age 83, we had great conversations all throughout the day with Tim Brando, with Matt Taylor, with Fran Faschilla, with Seth Greenberg. Podcast is up. You can get it wherever you get your podcast. A little bit later today, just search Query and Company wherever you get those podcasts.
Absolutely, man. And it was, listen, it's not a fun day because Bob Knight passed away, but I thought it was a good show, Jimmy. I thought you had some really interesting things to say about the life and certainly the coaching accomplishments of Bob Knight. So great job by you.
Right
Good
back
to
at you.
Split a microphone with you.
Right back at you. Always fun. Can't wait to do it again tomorrow.
Yes. Keep it locked right here on The Fan. JMV up next. We'll see you.